My name is Richard Guerin from Orange Mountain Music, and today I am taking a look at the forthcoming set of symphonies from Philip Glass. This is an 11-disc set comprised of all the symphonies that Philip Glass has written to date, numbers 1 through 10, 9 of which were commissioned by Dennis Russell Davies at his various musical posts throughout the years. This is, like I say, an 11-disc set. It's pretty substantial, heavy. It comes with a 24-page booklet, and the continuity is Dennis Russell Davies has conducted this entire set, as he has done with all the symphonies of Haydn, of which there are more than 100, and all the symphonies of Bruckner, of which we're not quite sure how many there are. They're between 9 plus Symphony Number 0 plus Symphony Number 00 plus all the different variations. And I once asked Dennis Russell Davies which versions of the Bruckner symphonies he's covered, and he said he's covered all of them. And he's been currently working on recording the Schubert Symphony Cycle with the Basel Symphony Orchestra. But for now, this represents the third complete symphony cycle, along with Haydn and Bruckner, that the conductor has covered. In fact, Dennis Russell Davies is responsible for most of this body of work being commissioned. The famous, as Glass puts it, Davies wasn't going to let Glass become one of those opera composers that never writes a symphony, of which there's a long tradition, everybody from Verdi and Puccini to many others. So beginning in 1992, Davies started commissioning Glass to write this music, which is now extended to more than 2 decades, and from 1992 to 2012. So it's just about 2 years that he composed these 10 symphonies. The orchestras represented on this set are, you can see at the top of the list, the Bruckner Orchestra Linz. That's where Davies has been since 2004, I believe. In any case, he's been there for quite a long time, and he'll be wrapping up his music directorship there in not too long. The Symphony Orchestra Basel in Switzerland, he's been with that ensemble since 2009, and he's finishing with them this season. And he was formerly music director at the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra, as well as the Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra. All the soloists, including these choirs that you see, those are featured on symphonies number 5 and 6 and 7. But most of the other symphonies are purely instrumental in nature. That's not to say that they're based solely on Glass's own material, as in the case of symphonies number 1 and 4, which features the music of David Bowie and Brian Eno. Which is very common with sets of this kind nowadays. There are these nice thin sleeves. I quite like this, the design, this multicolored design. This box set was designed by Orange Mountain music director Don Christensen, with featuring photographs by Andreas Bittisnich, who you might recognize the style from the cover of the complete piano etudes on Orange Mountain Music, as well as Symphony Number 10. I actually quite like these photos. You see another one here of Dennis Russell Davies. This 24-page booklet features all of the, it's got a bio for Philip Glass as well as Dennis Russell Davies. It features all the information on the symphonies as far as the commissioning credits, recording credits, movements, tracks, all that stuff. But it also features the texts that are used in Symphony Number 5 and 6. An interesting decision. They could have included only perhaps a smaller number of CDs, but the decision was made that each symphony would have its own CD, with the exception of Symphony Number 5, which comprises two CDs worth. So there's quite a bit of history here, which is really interesting. Symphony Number 1, Low, many of you know, it was known as the Low Symphony for a very long time, and really wasn't until later when other numbered symphonies started to appear, that it was understood that this was Philip Glass's first symphony. It was commissioned in 1992 by the Brooklyn Philharmonic Orchestra and premiered at the Brooklyn Academy of Music with Davies conducting. He was the music director there at the time. And that was 1992. And then I've always theorized that when you look at the proportions of Symphony Number 1 and 2, they're both in 3 movements with really long movements. They're both about 45 minutes each. That Symphony Number 1 was really a tentative step in the direction of writing symphonies for Philip Glass. In some way, it's a fascinating piece on its own, which we're now only starting to reconsider with the recent passing of David Bowie. But without a doubt, Bowie and Eno's music and their contribution can't be understated. And what Glass did with it as time goes by, with what he did with that material is very interesting. Symphony Number 2 is from only 2 years later. It was again commissioned and premiered at the Brooklyn Academy of Music with Davies conducting. It was the first symphony based solely on Glass's own music. It's for a large orchestra, and it was never personally my favorite, but over the past 5 years, it has become one of my favorites. It's a really interesting piece, and I finally had the opportunity to hear it in Rhode Island last year live, and it was really excellent. Symphony Number 3, on the other hand, is from 1995, and it was commissioned by the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra, where Dennis Russell Davies was music director, and it's written for that ensemble of specifically its string players. Davies had always said that it was written to be a companion piece to Strauss's Metamorphosen for 23 solo strings, and taking that point of departure, Glass used the 19 strings of the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra and put them through the ringer. It's actually a fascinating first movement, sort of prelude to a fast-moving second movement, which is more reminiscent of Bartók's music for strings, percussion celeste, than it is of anything written by Richard Strauss. But really, for people who love Philip Glass's music, it's the third movement, which is the slow movement, which is a slow building chaconne on which Glass develops the process by virtue of adding voices. So it's one voice and then 2 voices and 3 voices until ultimately you have 19 lines of counterpoint going at once, and it's really one of the most fine examples of that type of writing in Glass's catalog. But the palette itself of being only 19 strings is quite different from the grand symphonies of which are Symphonies Number 1 and Number 2. In 1996, we find Symphony Number 4, and Glass revisits the music of David Bowie and Brian Eno, but this time it's in a very different way. In fact, the score to Symphony Number 4 it says Hero Symphony, a symphonic ballet. In fact, Glass wrote this in response. It was commissioned, I believe, by the American Composers Orchestra, but he wrote it essentially as a ballet for the Twyla Tharp Company, having to do with again with David Bowie and Brian Eno's music. Instead of taking 3 tracks as a point of departure for this symphony, Glass took 6 songs and really treated them in a very different way than he had in the first symphony. These are shorter movements. All the movements are under 10 minutes. The variety in texture and orchestration is much different. And in fact, David Bowie himself, I believe he not much preferred, but he preferred how Glass internalized his material and came up with something fresh with this symphony from 1996. Only 3 years later, it seems Glass, by this time, we arrive at Symphony Number 5, as you can see here, that's on 2 discs. This is a grand 100-minute symphony with a big orchestra, chorus, children's chorus, soloists, and it's really a reflection on wisdom traditions, as Glass calls them, rather than religions. As Glass says, no religion has a monopoly on good ideas. Really, Glass compiled the texts for this huge piece from all sorts of religious sources, including the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Tibetan texts, all it's Jewish texts, Old Testament. It's really quite different from all of its orchestral precedents, as you see now. Glass always with a tendance towards being interested in the theater rather than in purely instrumental writing, really invested himself in this grand theatrical piece. I don't believe it's ever been staged, but to me it's always been one of those pieces that could be staged, and you can see here the resources required to produce this piece. As such, it's not often done. Symphony Number 6 premiered in 2002, only months after 9/11 at Carnegie Hall, and with soprano Lauren Flanagan and the American Composers Orchestra. The piece was commissioned by the Bruckner House Linz, as well as Carnegie Hall, and on the occasion of Philip Glass's 65th birthday. Upon first listening, I mean, as you could see, Glass turned towards using texts in his symphonies. Upon hearing it first time, I can't say that I was immediately in love with it. What had started as a piece for piano and a collaborative piece for piano and voice, the voice being of the eminent American poet Allen Ginsberg, who had passed away in the 1990s. This was Glass's chance to fully realize that idea, and he said later, when he reconsidered it in composition of this symphony, all of a sudden the piano had been replaced by an orchestra, and Allen Ginsberg's voice had been replaced by a soaring soprano. Upon first listening, it was, I don't want to say it was difficult, but only 3 years later, at the premiere of Symphony Number 8, Symphony Number 6 was placed on the second half of that program, and it coincided with the release of Symphony Number 6 on Orange Mountain Music. And since that time, having had a chance to consider it anew in multiple times, I'm really convinced it's one of the more powerful symphonic compositions that Philip Glass has ever composed. Only a couple years later, now we find ourselves in 2005. This is Symphony Number 7, which was premiered under the title A Toltec Symphony. And it had to do, the Toltec is an ancient Mesoamerican culture which disappeared, and its history is highly debated. In any case, Glass became very interested in this culture after years of exploring topics of ancient cultures in other parts of the world, including everything from Egyptian pharaohs with Akhenaten to Tibetan culture to Japanese culture. It was seemingly a big shock to Glass that he could find such a rich and ancient culture just right here in our neighborhood in North America. The piece was commissioned for Leonard Slatkin's 60th birthday at the National Symphony Orchestra at the Kennedy Center, and premiered in 2005. The second and third movement utilize a chorus. The piece was premiered, and then it wasn't performed for a number of years, and it wasn't until this recording, which was made, I believe, around 2010. It was done at the end of 2008, January 2009. This recording was made, that the piece underwent some serious revision by Glass. He excised a